Today, I want to share with you a story about a man who had almost forgotten what it felt like to be alive, and a woman who arrived on his doorstep carrying more pain than she ever spoke aloud. Ethan Rowe had lived on the Wyoming prairie for most of his life. But dawn had never felt as hollow as it did that morning. He stood on the porch of his ranch house, boots planted in the frost-hardened boards, the wind cutting across the land with a sharpness that seemed meant for him. The world was quiet, too quiet. No cattle lowing in the distance. No warmth behind the windows of his home. Just a cold breeze and the faint tick of the pocket watch he kept turning over in his palm. 6:47. The stagecoach was late. Ethan didn't blame the driver. February on the plains could break even the strongest man, but he'd been awake long before sunrise, unable to shake the heaviness in his chest, the kind that had settled there 3 years ago. The day he buried his wife. Some men grow harder after grief. Some grow mean. Ethan had grown quieter, a shadow of the man he used to be. The ranch he and his wife built still had good bones, whitewashed siding, strong post and beam frame, but inside, the rooms echoed when he walked. A place once filled with warm laughter now held nothing but his own footsteps and the creak of old floorboards. He talked to the horses more than he talked to people. Some days he forgot the sound of his own voice. That's why he had agreed to the arrangement. A mail-order contract. Cold. Efficient. Practical. A woman needed security. He needed help around the ranch, and maybe a little something to keep the silence from swallowing him whole. No romance. No expectations. No risk. Just two people doing what they had to do to get through the rest of their lives with a little less loneliness. Dust finally rose on the horizon, a thin line at first, then a gathering cloud. Ethan straightened. His fingers brushed against something inside his vest pocket. His late wife's ring. He still carried it, though he hadn't worn it in years. He told himself it was out of respect. The truth was more complicated. The stagecoach rolled in with a spray of frozen mud, the horses snorting steam into the morning air. The driver tipped his hat with a grin that wasn't quite friendly. "Your package." "Mr. Rowe." Ethan's jaw tightened. Not today. The coach door opened, and a woman stepped down, careful on the icy wheel hub. She wore a dark green traveling coat buttoned tight to her throat, gloves worn but clean, and a small trunk at her feet. For a moment, she kept her head lowered, the brim of her hat shadowing her face. Her posture was rigid, disciplined, like someone holding herself together by sheer will. Then she looked up. Ethan's breath caught. The right side of her face was marked by old frostbite scars, pale, puckered lines that pulled at the corner of her mouth and narrowed her eye. Not cruelly, just honestly. It was the kind of scar that told a story without a single word being spoken. A story of suffering. Survival. Winter storms she must have fought through alone. The left side of her face was untouched, almost delicate. A strange, aching contrast. She held his gaze without flinching. "I'm Marion Hale," she said. Her voice was steady. The kind of steady a person earns after too many years of bracing for judgment. "The agency didn't tell you, did they?" Ethan tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. He'd expected someone plain, someone practical. He hadn't expected this. A woman who looked like she'd walked through fire and ice and come out the other side with nothing left but dignity and fatigue. Marion saw all of it, the hesitation, the brief flicker of shock, the uncertainty he didn't have time to hide. Her chin lifted slightly, just enough to show she wasn't asking for pity. "If you wish to void the contract," she said quietly, "I can take the next stage east. I don't want to be a burden to anyone. Her words hit him like a blow. Because that's exactly what she expected, to be rejected quickly, efficiently. As though pain had become her traveling companion. Ethan looked at her, then really looked. At the way she stood straight despite exhaustion. At the tension in her shoulders. At the bravery it took just to step down in front of a stranger and offer her life into his hands. And suddenly a voice rose in his memory. Soft and familiar. His late wife's voice. The one he had tried to bury along with his grief. Choose kindness. Ethan, be better than your fear. He swallowed. The cold air burning his lungs. No, he said. The word rougher than intended. You're welcome here. The agreement stands. For the first time, her expression broke. Not fully, just a flicker. A widening of her eyes. A small, startled inhale. She tried to hide. The driver chuckled under his breath. Good luck. Row. You'll need it. Ethan ignored him. Ignored the lingering ache of hesitation. Ignored the sting of his own unpreparedness. Instead, he stepped forward, lifted Marion's small trunk, and nodded toward the ranch house behind him. Marion followed slowly, as if unsure whether she was walking toward a new life or another disappointment, and standing there, watching her take her first step onto his porch. Ethan Rowe felt something he hadn't felt in years. A beginning, and a fear he couldn't yet name. Marion Hale had been in Ethan Rowe's home for less than 5 minutes when she understood the shape of his loneliness. Dust lay thick along the windowsills. Curtains hung tired and sun-faded. The wood floors bore the dull, gray sheen of months, maybe years, without a proper scrubbing. It was not filth. Ethan wasn't a careless man. It was something far sadder, a house abandoned by life. She slipped out of her heavy traveling coat, folded it neatly over a chair, and began looking through the kitchen with the calm efficiency of someone who had survived harder places than this. Ethan stood just inside the doorway, too unsure to step closer and too proud to retreat. He watched her move through the rooms like someone taking inventory of damage. Her hands brushed over forgotten shelves, cracked crockery, a table that needed wiping, a stove that needed tending. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Every quiet movement of hers seemed to ask him a question he wasn't ready to answer. How long have you been living like this? Marion found a basin of water, rolled up her sleeves, and began wiping the table with clean, steady strokes without asking permission, without waiting for an invitation, as though this was simply the work she was meant to do. Or perhaps the work that kept her grounded when everything else in her life had come undone. Ethan shifted uneasily. He wasn't used to another body in the house. Not since his wife died. The presence of a second set of footsteps, a second breath in the room, felt foreign enough to make his throat tighten. He tried to speak once or twice, some half-formed apology for the mess, but Marion was already reaching for the next task. The next corner. The next neglected detail. She was not avoiding him. She simply seemed to understand the rules of this kind of silence. Her scarred cheek caught the lamplight when she finally turned toward him. Where do you keep your rags? Mr. Rowe. He pointed toward a drawer beside the sink. There. But you don't have to. She nodded once, found the rags, and went right on working. Ethan swallowed hard. I can show you the bedrooms. You ought to have the proper room upstairs. It has more space. Marion paused, but only long enough to gather her thoughts. The small room off the kitchen will do. He frowned. That's not a proper bedroom. It's fine, she replied, her tone polite but firm. I'm here to work. Mr. Rowe, keep your home. Cook your meals. Mend what needs mending. Nothing more expected. Nothing more offered. The small room is sufficient. He felt something inside him twist some old instinct to argue. To insist she take the better room. To prove he wasn't the kind of man who hid his wife beside the stove like an afterthought. But Marian had already turned her head. Returning her attention to the table she was wiping down, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't harden her tone. Her words were simply, a wall. Not cruel. Just carefully built. Ethan retreated to the barn under the pretense of checking his horses. But the horses didn't need checking. He needed distance. Needed air. Needed to make sense of the feeling that had snuck up on him the moment Marian claimed the servants' room, a feeling that he'd started this arrangement believing he wanted a worker, not a wife, and was now discovering the ache that came with the idea she might be nothing more than that. By the time he returned to the house, the sun had dipped fully behind the Wyoming hills. The kitchen smelled faintly of something warm beans, simmered with herbs, and a bit of salt pork. Marian was ladling stew into 2 bowls. Her movements efficient. Practiced. As though cooking for strangers was a thing she'd done 100 times before. They sat across from each other at the small wooden table. The silence between them was not hostile, but it was heavy-shaped by 2 lives that had been stripped down by hardship and loss. Marian kept her eyes low, her spoon moving in quiet rhythm. Ethan stared at the grain of the tabletop, unable to meet her gaze without feeling something unfamiliar rise in his chest. In the corner of the room, the marriage certificate lay on the mantel where he'd placed it earlier that morning. The paper looked stark under the lamplight. A reminder of promises neither of them had been brave enough to understand fully. Ethan noticed Marian glance at it once quickly, as if checking whether she'd imagined it. But neither of them mentioned it. Stew's good. He finally managed. Thank you. She answered. I used what was in your pantry. They finished eating in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable, but wasn't hostile either. Something lived in that quiet, something fragile and unspoken. Something neither of them had language for yet. Marian washed the dishes afterward. Sleeves still rolled. Her movements steady and sure. Ethan stood in the doorway again, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. You can leave them, he said. It's been a long day. She didn't look up. Work is what I do best. There was no bitterness in her words. But there was no softness either. Just tired truth. When the last dish was set aside, Marian disappeared into the small room beside the kitchen. She closed the door gently, almost apologetically, as though trying to take up as little space as possible. Behind that door, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the moment when Ethan would knock, clear his throat, and tell her he'd changed his mind, that he didn't want a scarred woman in his home. She had lived through enough rejection to recognize the pattern before it even began. But the knock never came. Out in the barn, Ethan sat on a bale of hay, rubbing his hands over his face, trying to make sense of the tightening in his chest. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It wasn't love. It was something quieter, something unsettling, something like noticing the first warm current of air after the longest winter of your life. 2 strangers slept under one roof that night, both tense, both cautious, both aware of each other in the darkness. They didn't speak it aloud, but they felt it. The beginning of something neither had expected and neither knew how to handle. It was late morning when Ethan hitched the wagon and told Marian they'd ride into Larkspur for supplies. She nodded without looking at him, tying a thin veil over her hair before stepping outside. The veil wasn't much, just a light piece of fabric meant to soften the winter wind, but they both knew it served another purpose. It shielded her face from the stares she wasn't ready to face. Ethan noticed. Of course. He noticed everything about her more than he intended to. The calm way she tied the knot behind her ear, the slight tremble in her hands she tried so hard to hide, the way she braced herself before climbing into the wagon bench, as if preparing for battle rather than a simple trip to town. He didn't comment. He didn't know if he had the right. The wagon rolled across frozen ruts, the prairie stretching wide and indifferent around them. Marian sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, keeping her posture stiff, composed, as though she feared that even relaxing her shoulders might reveal too much. Ethan wanted to speak about the weather, the ranch, anything, but every sentence he rehearsed sounded wrong in his head. Too familiar, too distant, too much of something he wasn't ready to feel. They reached Larkspur by early afternoon, a small frontier town, but big enough that gossip traveled faster than the wind. The moment the wagon wheels touched the main road, it felt as though the entire place inhaled sharply, readying itself. The townsfolk noticed them immediately. Some paused with feed sacks halfway lifted. Some turned their heads slowly, pretending not to stare. Others whispered openly, leaning toward one another, as if sharing prayer requests instead of cruelty. Marian kept her gaze fixed on the general store's sign, refusing to look left or right. She didn't need to see their faces. She'd lived long enough to sense judgment the way other people sensed rain coming. Inside the town's small bustle, she walked with dignified restraint. Not proud, not timid, just determined not to let her shoulders slump under the weight of all those eyes. Ethan walked beside her, but he felt taller and smaller at the same time. Taller from the urge to shield her, smaller from the shame of realizing he hadn't prepared her for this. He had brought her into a place that would carve her open for sport, and he had done nothing to stop it. The first blow came from the preacher's wife. Mrs. Hawthorne swept toward them like a winter storm, dressed in church lace. Her smile too wide, too bright, and too rehearsed. "Mr. Rowe," she sang, clasping her hands. "And this must be the young woman from your arrangement." She stepped closer, peering at Marian through the veil with exaggerated sympathy. "My dear," she said, voice dripping with sweetness too sharp to swallow, "you are so brave, and so unfortunate. Bless your heart for traveling all this way in your condition, and bless Mr. Rowe for taking you in. Truly an act of Christian charity." Marian said nothing. She didn't flinch or shrink. Though Ethan saw her hands tighten around the fabric of her skirt, he felt heat rise beneath his collar, not at Mrs. Hawthorne's words, but at himself, at how quiet he remained while Marian endured it. Before he could respond, two young women near the fabric counter giggled behind a bolt of calico. Their whispers weren't subtle. Their eyes darted between Marian's veil and Ethan's face, as though trying to decide which of the two was the greater tragedy. Ethan's jaw clenched so hard it ached. He had expected whispers, maybe even curiosity. He hadn't expected open cruelty. Marian carried herself with the dignity of someone who had long grown used to being stared at. She walked the aisles choosing flour, sugar, coffee, and soap with quiet precision. She didn't linger. She didn't ask questions. She didn't complain. She simply did the work she had come to do, as though silence itself were her armor. But silence could only do so much. Cole Renner arrived outside the store just as they were loading supplies into the wagon. Tall, well-dressed, and smug with the confidence of a man who had never lost a battle he didn't want to fight. He owned the biggest ranch in the region and believed that gave him the right to speak without a filter. "Well now," Renner drawled, tipping his hat with an exaggerated flourish. "Ethan Rowe, Didn't realize you were running a charity ranch. Ethan's hands tightened on the sack of feed. Renner turned his gaze to Marion, and Ethan saw the moment Renner registered her scars. The small widening of his eyes, the cruel smile forming before he spoke. "Ma'am," he said mockingly, "brave of you to show your face in town. Though I suppose with the veil, it's only half your face we're looking at." Marion's spine stiffened, but she said nothing. Instead, she reached for a 50-pound sack of flour, hefted it onto her hip, and walked past Renner without acknowledging him. Her strength stunned Ethan. Her silence shamed him. Renner chuckled. "Tell me, Ro, did they give her to you at a discount, or did they pay you to take her off their hands?" The words hit like cold steel. Ethan opened his mouth, but the right words didn't come. Anger, grief, guilt, all of it mixed into a heavy knot that stuck in his throat. Fear of saying too much. Fear of saying too little. Fear of revealing how deeply he had already begun to care. His silence spoke louder than any insult. Renner laughed and walked away. Marion climbed into the wagon, her face unreadable behind the veil. They left town without a single word between them. The prairie stretched wide, the ruts jarring the wagon as they traveled home. The silence was thick, not from anger, but from a deeper, older kind of hurt. Marion kept her eyes fixed on the horizon. It was she who spoke first. Quietly, "You don't owe me defense, Mr. Rowe." The words cut deeper than Renner's cruelty ever could. Ethan swallowed, staring at the reins in his hands. "Maybe," he whispered, "I owe myself one." For the first time since she'd stepped off the stagecoach, Marion turned toward him, not fully, just enough to see the truth he hadn't meant to reveal. Something in her softened. Not much, just a crack in the armor, but enough to let the first hint of possibility through. Night settled over the Rowe Ranch with a quiet that pressed against the windows and crept beneath the doors. It was the kind of darkness that didn't simply blanket the land, it seeped into the bones of the house and into the people who lived inside it. Ethan Rowe sat alone at the kitchen table, the single oil lamp casting a small circle of gold around him. Outside, the wind worried the edges of the barn. Inside, the only sound was the soft tick of the clock on the mantel and the faint breathing of a house that had been empty for too long. In front of him lay the marriage contract, a thin sheet of paper, light enough to fold into an envelope, fragile enough to tear with one careless tug. Yet tonight, it felt heavy as an anvil. He stared at it, hands clasped loosely before him, and wondered how a man could feel so divided between two lives. He thought of his late wife, not in the soft, warm way he once had, but with the complicated ache of someone trying to release a memory that had long since turned into a chain. 3 years had passed since he buried her. Yet some part of him still lived in that graveyard, still braced for loss, still preparing for grief before it arrived. Loving once had nearly destroyed him. Loving again felt impossible, and yet he thought of Marion, lifting that 50-pound sack of flour in Larkspur, while Cole Renner laughed like it was a show put on for him alone. He thought of the way Marion's hands tightened on her skirt when the preacher's wife patted her arm in false sympathy. Thought of the veil Marion wore not for the cold, but because she had long learned to shield herself from the cruelty of the world. He had stood there, silent, frozen, torn between rage and fear. A grown man who could break a wild horse, but couldn't find his voice for a woman who had survived far worse than gossip. The shame of it burned through him now. He ran a thumb over the edge of the contract, his name already printed neatly on the line where it should go, waiting, expecting, demanding a choice he had been avoiding since the moment Marion stepped off that stagecoach and met his eyes with quiet resignation. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands over his face. He didn't know what he was to Marion. Not a husband. Not yet. Not even a partner in any emotional sense. Just a man she worked beside, cooked for, cleaned up after, a roof to stand under, a table to sit at, a bed of her own behind a closed door. And yet something had shifted. He had felt it in the way she moved through the house, softened corners here and there. Curtains cleaned, dishes washed with the steady rhythm of someone who didn't expect thanks. He felt it in the way she kept her distance, a careful step away from warmth, as though she'd been burned by it more than once. He felt it in himself, too, in the way her presence tugged something awake inside him, something he had once buried alongside his wife. His hand hovered over the pen. A simple stroke of ink could change everything, or change nothing. He didn't know which possibility frightened him more. Wind rattled against the windows. The lamp flickered. He breathed in the cold night air leaking through the walls, and finally, without ceremony or hesitation, he picked up the pen. His signature flowed smoothly, dark and bold across the page. Ethan Rowe. A name written with the weight of a promise he did not yet fully understand, but one he could no longer ignore. The decision settled over him like a sigh. Not peace, exactly, but a deeper kind of certainty. He set the pen down and stared at what he had done. It was done. Whatever came next, the choice belonged to him. The door to the small room creaked softly. Marion stepped into the kitchen, wrapped in a modest shawl, her hair braided loose over one shoulder. She had not expected to find him awake, let alone seated before the contract like a man confessing a private sin. She paused in the doorway, fingers tightening on the edge of the shawl. Her eyes moved from Ethan to the lamp, to the document. She froze. The signature was unmistakable. For a long breath, she didn't move, didn't speak. She stood rooted in place, as if someone had reached into her chest and taken hold of her heartbeat with bare hands. Finally, she whispered, "Why now?" Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't hopeful. It was steady and tired, and full of all the years she had spent being chosen last or not chosen at all. Ethan looked up at her, his face open in a way she hadn't seen before. "Because," he said quietly, "I keep my promises." There were better words, perhaps. Words that could have soothed her or explained the fear pressed beneath his ribs. But Ethan had never been a man of speeches. He spoke truth when he could, clumsily but honestly, and Marion heard the honesty in this one. She stepped forward slowly, unsure, each move betraying the uncertainty of a woman who had never been given anything without strings. The shawl slipped slightly from her shoulder as she approached the table. She set it right, inhaled deeply, and lowered herself into the chair opposite Ethan. The pen lay between them. For a moment she didn't touch it. Her fingers hovered, trembling, as though the slightest mistake might shatter whatever fragile possibility lived between them. Then, with a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, Marion picked up the pen. Her name, Marion Hale, followed his in neat, careful letters. A woman signing not because she believed in fairy tales, not because she trusted the world, but because a man had finally spoken to her with respect instead of pity. When she finished, she set the pen down gently. Ethan didn't speak. Marion didn't either. Two names sat together on a page that promised something neither of them could yet define. Not love, not safety, not certainty, but perhaps a beginning. The lamp flickered again. The wind outside calmed, and in that quiet room, Two wounded souls sat across from each other, united by a signature neither understood but both had chosen. Winter did not ask permission before it took hold of the Rowe Ranch. One morning, the air simply sharpened. The sky pressed low, and the snow began to fall with the quiet authority of a season that knew exactly what it was doing. But inside the house, something softer had begun to take root. In the weeks since Marion signed the contract, life found a steady rhythm, gentle, almost accidental. Ethan woke each morning to the sound of Marion moving through the kitchen. Her footsteps light but purposeful. Sometimes she hummed under her breath small, forgotten melodies from a life before scars and sorrow. The first day he heard it, Ethan paused mid-buttoning his shirt, startled by how warm the sound felt after years of silence. She cooked simple meals, stews with herbs he didn't know she carried in her traveling bag, cornbread that filled the house with smells he had nearly forgotten, coffee that tasted better because someone other than himself had made it. And though neither of them said it aloud, Ethan found himself listening for her footsteps the way a lonely man listens for signs of spring. Marion noticed things too. How Ethan placed his boots by the door with habitual precision. How he cleared his throat before speaking, as though unused to the weight of his own voice. How he always made sure the fire was stacked high enough to keep the house warm late into the night. She didn't comment on any of it. She simply absorbed these small truths, the way a person absorbs sunlight after a long winter. Little daily moments, barely more than glances and shared spaces, began shaping themselves into something neither of them dared acknowledge. It might have continued that way, quiet, careful, unspoken if not for the blizzard. It arrived sudden and fierce, swallowing the ranch in white. By noon, the fence posts vanished beneath waves of drifting snow. By dusk, the world beyond their windows had disappeared entirely, replaced by a storm that screamed against the walls like a warning from the heavens. They were trapped. On the first day, they kept their distance. Ethan chopped firewood, wiped snow from the porch, pretended the weight of the storm didn't bother him. Marion stayed inside, kneading dough with steady hands, tending the fire with practiced grace. They spoke only when necessary about supper. The horses, the growing cold, the silence between them felt polite but cautious, like two travelers sharing a stagecoach who weren't sure how close to sit. The second day loosened something. By mid-morning, the wind eased just enough to make conversation possible. And Marion found an old checkers board tucked in a drawer beneath the stove. She set it on the table without ceremony. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You play, only badly," she admitted. He sat down across from her. "We'll match then." She lost 3 games in a row. The fourth, Ethan tried to let her win, but she caught him, narrowed her eye, and accused him of sabotage. He denied it. She called him a liar softly, with a small grin she didn't realize she'd made. When she flicked a checker at him in mock frustration, Ethan caught it one-handed. Surprised into a laugh he hadn't heard from himself in years. It wasn't loud, but it was real. By the evening of the second day, they were exchanging small stories, nothing deep, nothing raw, just pieces of themselves offered cautiously. Marion spoke of her mother's garden back east. Ethan shared the tale of the filly he'd raised from birth. Their words overlapped like 2 rivers learning how to run beside each other. On the third day, the storm grew quieter, as though winter itself was leaning close to listen. Marion found a slim book of poetry on the shelf, something Ethan's wife had once read. She hesitated before opening it, but eventually settled into the chair beside the fire, reading aloud in a voice softened by the glow of lamplight. Ethan pretended to whittle a new handle for the barn latch. But the truth was he barely heard the words. He watched her instead. Watched the way she curled one foot beneath her skirt, the way her face gentled when she forgot to guard it, the way her voice steadied on words that sounded like hope, and for the first time, he let himself imagine what it might mean to be a man who could make a woman like her feel safe. Later that evening, the storm waned, and the fire burned low. Marian's voice grew quiet, her eyelids heavy. She finished a line of poetry, paused, and did not begin the next. The book slipped slightly in her lap. She leaned back. Exhaustion, overcoming caution, she fell asleep. Ethan set aside his whittling knife, heart thudding beneath his shirt. He hesitated only a moment before stepping toward her. He lifted her with slow, careful strength, surprised by how light she felt, how natural it was to carry her close. His hands trembled, not from effort, but from the fragile intimacy of the moment. He carried her to her room, laid her gently on the bed, pulled a blanket to her shoulders, a boundary crossed quietly, one made not of desire, but of tenderness. When morning came, the world outside lay still beneath a fresh white silence. Marian woke in her own bed, disoriented, unsure how she'd gotten there. A warmth spread slowly through her chest, not fear, not embarrassment, but something far gentler, something dangerously close to trust. In the kitchen, Ethan poured coffee with hands that shook just slightly. Their eyes met when she entered, and though neither spoke of what had happened, something in the air had changed. Not everything, but enough. The storm outside had passed. The one inside them had just begun to thaw. Spring did not arrive all at once on the Rowe Ranch. It crept in, gently melting snowbanks first, softening the ground next, and finally coaxing green shoots from soil long frozen. The land seemed to stir from sleep, stretching awake beneath the warmer sky, and with every sign of new life outside, something inside the house began to shift as well. Ethan had never planted a garden without his wife. The memory of those old springs, their laughter, her scattered seeds had always stopped him from trying again. But Marian stood beside him with a basket of seed packets and dirt on her palms. And for the first time in years, the soil didn't feel like a grave he was digging into. It felt like possibility. They knelt in the earth together, fingers brushing occasionally as they planted tomatoes, beans, squash, rows of hope arranged in quiet lines. Marian's touch was gentle but sure, as though she'd done this 100 times before. "My mother taught me," she said, patting the earth lightly. "Said gardens grow best when you hum to them." Ethan glanced at her. "Do you still believe that?" She didn't answer with words. She simply hummed soft, almost shy, a tune he didn't recognize but instantly cherished. He stopped planting just to listen. She blushed when she noticed his stillness, her hum fading like it had never been there. But Ethan's voice came rough and honest. "Don't stop. It's nice." That small moment, her humming, his listening felt bigger than the seeds beneath their hands. A few days later, Ethan returned from town with a brown-wrapped package tucked under his arm. He carried it into the kitchen like a man protecting something fragile. Marian looked up from the dough she was kneading, wary but curious. "For you," he said. Placing the package on the table, Marian hesitated, as though fearing whatever lay inside might vanish if she touched it. She unwrapped the paper slowly, her breath caught, blue calico fabric, soft, new, beautiful. The first new thing she'd owned in years. Her fingers sank into the folds with disbelief, tenderness, and the kind of gratitude that lived too deep for words. She turned her face slightly away, trying to hide the way her eyes shimmered. "I can't accept this," she whispered. "It's not charity," he said gently. "You deserve something pretty." No one had ever told her that. Not once. Not ever. Her voice cracked when she murmured, "Thank you." It was the first time Ethan felt her vulnerability fully not guarded, not hidden behind strength, but open enough to shake him. That night, she stayed up late, cutting the fabric by lamplight. Ethan pretended to read, though the words on the page blurred every time he glanced at her bent over her sewing, illuminated by warm light, like some fragile, golden thing he'd been entrusted with. A week later, just as the sun dipped behind the hills, the porch turned into a quiet, sacred place. Marian sat beside him, her shoulder almost brushing his. They watched the sky shift from orange to soft purple. She leaned against him, hesitant at first, then gently letting her weight settle as though testing whether he'd pull away. He didn't. Ethan's heartbeat quickened, the warmth of her against his arm, the scent of her hair stirred by the soft evening breeze. It was more than closeness. It was permission, invitation, a step neither of them had spoken aloud. His hand rose halfway, almost of its own accord, drawn toward her cheek, toward the scars, toward the bravery they held. Marian turned her face slightly toward him, breath trembling, eyes soft with unguarded hope. For a single painful moment, he almost kissed her. Almost. But the ghost of his late wife rose between them unseen, uninvited. The weight of old vows he believed he was betraying pressed down on him. Fear flooded his chest. Fear of loving again. Fear of failing again. Fear of losing again. He hesitated, just for a heartbeat. But heartbreak can fit into a heartbeat. Marian felt it instantly. The recoil, the conflict, the doubt. She withdrew so quickly it felt like cold air rushing in. I should go inside," she whispered, already rising. "Marian," he began, but she shook her head, not trusting her voice, and slipped inside the house. He heard her door close, then quietly lock. Ethan sat on the porch long after the last light faded, staring at the place where she had sat moments before. His hands trembled with all the words he hadn't spoken. The truth buried beneath fear. Inside her small room, Marian pressed her hands to her mouth to muffle her sobs. She had let herself hope for the first time in years, and hope had turned to ice in her chest. Two people lay awake that night under the same roof, separated not by walls, but by their own brokenness. Both hearts beating hard, both yearning, both hurting, both wondering if they had ruined something fragile before it even had a chance to bloom. Spring had barely settled over Larkspur when the gossip found Marian again. Cruel words have a way of traveling faster than truth on the frontier, carried by women with busy hands and empty hearts. She had gone into town for yeast and lamp oil, her veil pulled low, hoping the morning crowd might be gentler than the Sunday congregation. But gentleness was a rare commodity in Larkspur. She was standing near the shelf of dried herbs when two ranch wives wandered in, their voices pitched just loud enough to be heard, their eyes pretending not to follow her movements. "Poor Ethan Rowe," one whispered. "Imagine being stuck with her. A wife he can't take into town without shame. Did you see the way he looked at her last week? Like he was embarrassed to even walk beside her?" Embarrassed, the other scoffed. He practically flinched. "I'd lock myself inside if I had to live with a face like that." Marian went still. The air thinned. Something cracked quietly inside her, something she'd worked months to rebuild. She set down the packet in her hand, leaving it on the counter as though it had burned her fingers. She walked out of the store without a word, the women's whispers echoing behind her like thorns lodged beneath her ribs. It wasn't the first time she'd been judged, but it was the first time the judgment had cut this deeply because it spoke of Ethan. Because it suggested he felt what she feared most: shame, regret, embarrassment. She returned to the ranch riding in silence, each jolt of the wagon deepening the bruise forming in her chest. Later that afternoon, the clatter of hooves approached the house. Marian opened the door, wiping flour from her hands. Expecting Ethan, it wasn't him. Cole Renner sat tall in the saddle, one gloved hand holding his reins, the other gripping an envelope thick enough to bulge at the edges. He tipped his hat with a smirk that held no warmth. "Afternoon, Mrs. Rowe." She stiffened. "What do you want?" "Mr. Renner." A moment of honesty. He dismounted with leisurely arrogance. "I figure nobody's given you that yet." He held out the envelope. $500. Enough to take you east, or south, or anywhere but here. Marian didn't reach for it. Renner chuckled. "Don't act proud. We both know Ethan deserves a woman who won't embarrass him in town. Let him find someone he's not ashamed to stand beside." Her breath trembled. Renner stepped closer. "You know it. I know it. The whole damn town knows it. This just makes it easier. Get off this property," she said softly. But he heard the tremor beneath the words, "I will." He replied, mounting again, "Just think about it. Isn't it kinder to leave before he throws you out?" He rode away, leaving the envelope on the porch rail like a wound. Marian stared at it for a long time, hands clenching and unclenching. She didn't touch it, but the damage had already been done. Ethan didn't return until dusk, exhausted from branding cattle, smelling of smoke, sweat, and a day's worth of struggle. He walked into the house expecting the usual quiet, expecting the smell of supper, expecting, he realized, to see Marian. Instead, he found her packing, her trunk open, her shawl folded, her new blue calico untouched on the table. He froze. "Marian, what are you doing?" She didn't look at him. "I need to ask you something first." He set down his gloves. "All right. Do you regret marrying me?" Her voice was so calm it frightened him. Ethan swallowed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. It had been a long day, too long. His thoughts foggy, his emotions tangled. The truth he wanted to speak. "No, I don't regret it. I regret not being brave enough to show you what you mean to me wouldn't come. It's complicated," he said quietly. He meant grief. He meant fear. He meant the war inside him he hadn't learned to explain. But Marian heard only one thing: "I want you gone." Her hand stilled, her face emptied of hope. The tiny spark she'd been carrying for weeks flickered out. "I'll be out by morning," she said. He stepped toward her. "Marian," but she shook her head, not in anger, in resignation. "It's all right. I understand." And the terrible thing was, she truly believed she did. That night, Ethan walked into the barn and stayed there, leaning against a post as if holding himself upright were too much. The sky outside turned black. The ranch went silent. Marian's small room remained lit long into the night as she folded everything she owned with cold, trembling fingers. Before dawn, she placed the untouched blue calico on the table, a gift too painful to carry. Then she walked away from the house, trunk on her shoulder, her footsteps quiet against the waking earth. Ethan watched from the window, watched her figure grow smaller, watched his fear freeze him in place one last time. He did not open the door. He did not call her name. And when she disappeared over the rise, the house once warmed by her presence fell back into the cold emptiness it had known for years. He sank into a chair, staring at the blue calico. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Rowe let his head fall into his hands and felt despair take him whole. The Rowe ranch felt hollow again the moment Marion disappeared over the rise. For a week, Ethan moved like a man dragging chains. He barely ate, barely slept, barely spoke. The house she had warmed with, small touches, fresh curtains, tidy shelves. Soft humming fell silent as a grave. Jed Mallory, the 70-year-old ranch hand who'd seen more truth than any preacher alive, finally cornered him in the barn. "Boy," he barked, "you let a woman who loved you walk away because you were scared. You fix it, or you'll regret it till the day you die." Those words cracked something open. Marion, meanwhile, sat alone in a boarding house room above Larkspur's general store. She held a train ticket east between her fingers, the paper shaking as much as her breath. Fear had followed her most of her life, but she was done letting it write her future. She tore the ticket in half, then in half again. She would not run, not anymore. Sunday morning. The church bells rang across town. Marion slipped into a back pew, trying to remain unseen. But Ethan Rowe walked through the doors as if the entire world depended on it, hat in hand, boots echoing against the floorboards. He marched straight down the aisle, straight to her. Every whispered rumor stopped cold. His voice carried through the sanctuary. "I was a coward. I don't regret a single moment with you. I want you home as my wife, not my burden. Judge her scars, and you judge mine first." Marion stood, tears trembling on her lashes. "You hurt me," she whispered. "I know," he said. "I'm scared." "Me too," she breathed. "So, let's be scared together." Her hand slipped into his, scarred cheek facing the crowd without shame. The whispers softened into applause. By summer, the garden they planted together bloomed in bright, wild abundance. They read on the porch at dusk, Marion's hair pulled back, her scars kissed by warm light. They spoke of chickens, more land, and maybe if life was kind, a child. Ethan leaned close. "I should have loved you from the first moment." Marion kissed him, slow and certain. Two broken souls, finally whole, not despite their scars, but through them. If this story moved you, share your thoughts below. Tell us where you're listening from, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Western Tales for more heartfelt frontier stories.